feel like everyone peeked ahead at my sermon for today. Yeah. If you're really loud, but I don't know enough about the soundboard to fix that. So, all right, welcome back. It's Sunday, so we're looking at Ruth today. We are on lesson 5, if I'm remembering correctly, because we finished lesson 4 last week. So we're on lesson. There are 8 lessons, but I need to double check because of how the numbering system is weird on this. It might actually only be 7 lessons. But we're close to the end, obviously. And we're probably going to need like a 2 to 3 week filler between the end of this and the start of the Augsburg Confession in September. So any ideas, I am open to that. Let me know. Keep that in the back of your head as we go on. But we are now in the 4th and last chapter of Ruth, and now the study is kind of slowing down because we obviously have 3 lessons on one chapter. So today we're just looking at the first 6 verses as we're going to set up all of the tension. And then the next lesson, the tension gets relieved. And then after that, we get our resolution of everything. So that's the dramatic focus of the narrative as we're working through it. So hopefully you have your lesson 5 packets. If not, there should be some back on the chair still. But I will just read the whole 6 verses that we're looking at today. We'll go through the questions, and hopefully we'll actually get through the whole lesson today instead of splitting up across 2 weeks like we have with the last couple. All right, so Ruth 4, 1 through 6. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belongs to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." So, plot twist. All right, so looking at our packet then, question 1. What promise had Boaz made to Ruth during their night at the threshing floor, what we were talking about last week, 3:13, for those of you who don't remember last week? Right. So he makes the promise that she will be redeemed one way or another. If this Redeemer is going to do it, she gets redeemed. If not, Boaz is going to step up to it. But he's going to make sure one way or another Ruth gets redeemed. And I could keep talking, but then I'd be answering another question ahead of time. So I will be silent now unless anyone else has input on number 1. Fairly short answer. All right, number 2 then. What had Boaz said to strengthen his promise when he says this to Ruth? You're on the right track. Yeah, as the Lord lives. So he's essentially swearing in the name of God that this will be fulfilled one way or another. Ruth is going to get redeemed as the Lord lives. He's swearing upon God's name to add strength to his promise, which you have to be careful about doing that, because question number 3 says, what instruction had the Lord given to Moses regarding the taking of an oath? Cross-reference to Numbers 30, 1 through 2 says, Moses spoke to the heads of the tribes of the people of Israel, saying, This is what the Lord has commanded. If a man vows a vow to the Lord, or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge, he shall not break his word. He shall do nothing to all that proceed, or he shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Right. Yeah. When you invoke God's name on an oath, then you really have to fulfill it, because otherwise that's a breaking of the second commandment, taking the Lord's name in vain. If you make a vow on the Lord's name and then you break it, you're setting yourself up for divine punishment then. So if you're going to vow something in God's name, make sure you do it. And that's why we have all of these warnings throughout Scripture about not swearing on God's name. You have it in, I know Ecclesiastes warns about swearing things in God's name just because it adds that extra threat of divine punishment, and sometimes things happen beyond your control that make it so you can't fulfill your vow, but you've put yourself on the hook by vowing it in God's name. Jesus tells us, I forget the citation, but he says, do not swear on anything on the earth or above the earth or in the sea below. Simply let your yes be yes and your no be no. And part of that is just the general instruction that you should be living an honorable and trustworthy life anyway, so that you don't need to borrow upon God's credibility when you say you're going to do something, but that you've built up a reputation for yourself where your word is your bond, and you can just say, I will do this, and people trust that you'll do it. But it also has that same warning, stuff happens outside your control sometimes. As he says this in Matthew 5, don't even make a vow by your own head, because you can't even control the color of your hair, or if your hair stays or falls out or anything. So if you can't even control those aspects about your own head, why would you vow something upon your own head? So, because things are outside of your control and they can impact you. And that's that other warning. When you make a vow in God's name, you are extra beholden to keep it. And you just need to be aware of all of what's going on and what will actually be in your control if you're going to make such a vow. And that's why theoretically you're supposed to treat it as such a big and important deal when people make a vow in God's name. That's why I don't know if we still do this anymore, but that's why they used to swear on the Bible when you're testifying in court. That's why you vow in the name of God when you're taking marriage vows and confirmation vows, because those things matter, and those are the things that you're really, really supposed to be called to hold fast to. But swearing on God's name is not something you should be doing just as like everyday promises. I swear in the name of God, I'll take the trash out tonight, because then you lose track of time and forget. But yeah, but yeah, and again, knowing the background info we have on Boaz, that he is a worthy man, he's a righteous man, he's a faithful Israelite who understands God's word. He knows what it means to be swearing in the name of the Lord, and so we're seeing here his dedication to making sure that Ruth is taken care of and that she gets redeemed one way or another. If this guy won't redeem you, I will redeem you, but one way or another, you're going to get redeemed. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, we have that reading between the lines. You see all the favorable treatment that he had given to Ruth the day before. It's pretty clear he's into her already. He knows her by reputation. She has, like we said, she has this really good reputation around town because of what she's done for Naomi. So he's already interested. The Ruth lying at his feet is just the nudge to get things going. But he's already, I'd say by the time that happens, he's already primed to make this happen even without Naomi's intervention and planning. Um, but yeah, good so far. Anything I'm missing? Questions, comments, concerns? All right. Number 4 then. Boaz had made a promise to Ruth, and he strengthened it with an oath. What action did Boaz then take to begin fulfilling this oath? Right, right. So chapter 3 ends with Naomi saying, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." And now it's today, and Boaz goes out to settle the matter. So he camps out at the place where he knows. I'm kind of answering the next question, but oh well. He camps out in a place where he knows this other redeemer is going to be, and he pulls him aside and he gathers the court essentially, and he's just like, "All right, let's settle this. You've got witnesses. What's going to happen?" Um, he sets up the situation to confront the redeemer and get him to say, "Are you going to redeem Ruth? Yes or no?" And then we'll go from there. Right. Yeah. Which we'll get into. Um, yeah, 5 through 7 are all kind of touching on this, so we'll just work through them, and I'll try not to answer ahead too much. So 5, who walked by as Boaz sat watching, and do you think this was a lucky encounter, or can you see God's hand at work? Explain. Um, so yeah, we kind of answered this already, but yeah, Boaz, he goes and he camps out at the city gate, and sure enough, the Redeemer walks by, and so he calls him aside and puts things in play. Is this a lucky encounter, or is it God's hands at work? I mean, yes. I mean, obviously, God is guiding. Oh, sorry. Yes. Yes. Yeah. 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 So they're all in a family tree because the right and responsibility of Redeemer goes through your blood relation. So Boaz was related to Elimelech in some way. The Redeemer just has a closer relationship to Elimelech. So um, yeah, they're family. They're like cousins or something. So the if you had a brother, that would be the first in line for the Redeemer. But Elimelech did not have any brothers. His sons are dead. Otherwise, they would have been Redeemers. So then you just kind of keep going out into the family tree until you find the next closest relative. Boaz is related to Elimelech, but this Redeemer has a closer relation to Elimelech, and that's why he gets the first right to say yay or nay on the redeeming. So we don't know exactly what the relation is. We just know they're relatives, and the Redeemer is a closer relative. So, like, the Redeemer is the cousin, and Boaz is a second cousin, or Boaz is first cousin once removed, or something. He's one step further away than this Redeemer is to Elimelech, and that's why this guy gets the first right to say if he'll redeem him or not. But yeah, they would have known each other. Again, small town, clan dynamics, tribal culture. Um, that's why when in the night before, when he's talking to Ruth, he already knows. What does he say? It is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. So he knows the family tree. He knows there's this guy is next in step, and then Boaz comes behind him. So he has to give this guy the opportunity to say yes before Boaz can just step up and say yes. But now he's confronting this guy, and he's saying, "All right, well, tell me, are you going to say yes, or can I say yes? Let's settle this." Um, and so, mhm. Mm. Yeah, yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. So is it luck or is it God's hand? Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. 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 So God's hand is at work because again, obviously, He's guiding this whole thing. I know we're getting to the tension point, but spoiler alert: we know Boaz and Ruth end up together, and they're the great grandparents of David, so they have their place in the whole lineage of salvation history. So God is guiding it there. He's guiding all of the events. He's making sure that the Redeemer and enough elders to form a quorum are there around the same time, so that all of this can be settled today. But on the other hand, I mean, this is they're they're in a most likely in a walled city. There's really only one way to get in and out of the city. You're in an agrarian culture, so most people live in the city, but then their fields are outside the city. So every morning they have to go out to the fields to do their work. So it's not if you're sitting at the city gate, which that's how it opens. Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. Um, there's a pretty good chance you're going to find whoever you're looking for is going to be passing by the gate at that day. So I mean, yeah, Boaz could have gotten there after the Redeemer had gone out already and missed him or something. Um, but you know where people are going to be, and if you have to find someone, you have a really good chance of finding them there. It's like, um, if I knew someone who worked, if I knew someone who lived here but worked in Fernley, and I had to get their attention, but I didn't know their phone number, I could just go out on uh, Highway 80. Is that 80? 50. Yeah. I don't know numbers, and I don't know. I just follow the GPS. I don't pay attention to the street name. Sorry. Hey, I could just go out on Highway 50 and just put up a sign for the person there, and I could be like reasonably sure they would see it because anyone who's going through Fernley goes down that road. That's like the only main way to get there. Yeah, that too. Um, yeah, when you know where everyone's going to go, um, it's not that hard to set things up where you can see that person. But again, yeah, right, yeah. Bethlehem's a pretty small city. Um, Again, that's the probably not quite the joke, but that's kind of the point when it's prophesied that the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem in it's either I think it's Malachi 2. Um, but you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small, out of you will come the Savior. I'm paraphrasing, but like Bethlehem's a really small city. It's significant because it's the city of David and later the city that Jesus comes out of. Um, but that's about all that you can really say for Bethlehem. Otherwise, it's just this really small city that everyone kind of ignores. And so when Malachi is like, "You're the smallest among all the clans. You really don't have much going for you, unless someone's a really big David fanboy and wants to come see where he was born. No one really goes to Bethlehem if they don't have to. It's a very small city, um, but such great things are going to come out of you. But yeah, it's a small city. Everyone kind of knows each other. Boaz and the Redeemer are relatives. They might already know each other's schedules somewhat because of that. We don't know how much they necessarily talked in their day-to-day life. Um, but it's not like the Redeemer lived over in Jerusalem and he just like happens to be in Bethlehem that day. And what a wonderful coincidence it all is that everything works out. You can see it as all being naturalistically happening by everyday occurrences. But you can also see how God has been orchestrating all of this. And again, knowing where Ruth and Boaz fit in salvation's history, we can see that he's matching everything up to according to plan. So I answer that yes. Um, it is a lucky encounter and it is God's hand at work same time. Makes sense. Yeah, luck comes from God. Yeah, I had a professor at seminary who was always very adamant that we never use the word luck because everything is providence, because providence means God guiding it. Which, yeah, we can write to the author of this study and say you should use providence instead of luck. Um, but I had a classmate who, on our last day of class, he went out and he got one of those little single individual boxes of Lucky Charms, and he sharpied out Lucky, and made it say Providence Charms, and he gave it to the professor since he was always railing about Providence over luck.
Really is timing.
Yeah.
Because we don't know his timeline.
Yeah. Yeah, it's timing. And again, God is controlling everything. And we could really turn this into a whole rabbit hole about free will, but that's not the point of this study, so we'll avoid doing that if we can help it. um, but yeah, I don't have a good segue away from that. So let's look at number 6 then. How did Boaz greet the kinsman redeemer? Yeah, so he seems to be pretty friendly. It's turn aside, friend, sit down here. So it's kind of a, hey, Bob, come sit and talk with me. Let's catch up. Haven't seen you in a while, sort of thing. So he's not jumping the gun and being like, Bob, why haven't you redeemed Ruth yet? Come on, man. Um, he's being friendly about it. He's being cordial. He's not setting up a hostile atmosphere. He's making sure he's being polite and he's kind of doing everything by the book, so to speak. Is that clear? Yeah. I feel like these aren't.
Did you even say if the Redeemer knew about him?
Right.
This may have been the first time you heard of it.
Maybe. I mean,
But if it's a small town.
yeah, he probably knew about her, and there's kind of an implication about that that we'll see in the coming verses. I think the Redeemer probably knows about Ruth already. Um, but I guess there's no real reason to bring that up in the greeting necessarily. He's just come sit down, let's talk. Maybe he could have been come. I want to talk to you about Ruth or something like that. But Boaz is setting up a confrontation. He knows he's setting up a confrontation, and I think he is catching the Redeemer off his guard a little bit, kind of to his own purposes, which we'll talk about in the next coming questions. Um, but he's not being a jerk about it either. He's still being cordial and friendly. It's maybe a little bit passive aggressive, but yeah, he's using the sugar. Yeah, you catch more flies with sugar than with vinegar. But at the same time, he's not being. I don't think he's being like two-faced or deceptive or trying to give him a false sense of security. Um, but he is kind of setting things up to his advantage a little bit by catching him off guard a bit, if that makes sense. It's making more sense in my head than how I'm expressing it. I'm sorry. Right. Right. Well, he wants to be able to have the quorum though, which we'll see in question 7. So going to his house, it would just be the two of them talking. Yeah, and that would be confrontational, and it's culturally it's not how you do things. But Graham at the city gate, where he's able to gather the elders together. Um, he's not going to his house, so it's less confrontational. It's just, oh, hey, haven't seen you in a while. Come talk to me. But then B, he has witnesses now, so whatever they discuss, they're going to have witnesses to corroborate it. So, he could go to the house and be like, are you going to redeem Ruth or not? And he could be like, oh, I'll redeem Ruth. And Boaz is like, okay, make sure that happens. And then he goes home, and then nothing happens because the guy doesn't follow through. And now Boaz, who has sworn on the name of the Lord that Ruth will be redeemed, is kind of up a creek without a paddle. But if he has witnesses there, so now that there's witnesses there, if he says you need to redeem Ruth, and the other guy says okay, I'll redeem Ruth, now there's other people who are going to hold him accountable to that, who are going to make sure that it happens and Ruth does get redeemed, and Boaz, who swore in the name of the Lord that Ruth would be redeemed, has seen his part through. Does that make sense? Yeah, he has a plan. Yeah, he 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 knows what he's doing in greeting him here too. Hmm. Yeah. Hmm. 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 Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So if he goes to his house, he's forcing his hand and saying he's making the implication you have to do this. By doing the meeting on neutral ground, he's leaving the option open either way. He's just saying we need to settle this, but I'm not forcing you to say yes or no. Well, I'm forcing you to give an answer, but it could be yes or no. I'm not pushing you one way or another necessarily. Yeah, yeah. Um, so we're getting it. Yeah. So we're leading. We've been circling around number 7. So we'll ask question 7 now. And we can continue this conversation. So we're all familiar with courtrooms. Draw a comparison between Boaz's choice of 10 elders as witnesses and today's courtroom setting. Not really a question, but yeah. Yeah, so there's not the same force that we have in today's courtroom setting. He didn't subpoena the Redeemer and like under penalty of law, you have to show up and testify at this thing. Um, yeah, yeah, hmm, yeah, hmm, yeah. This is just how things were done. This was, like we said, it's different from the courtroom setting today, and it's not. He's not forced to be there. He doesn't have like the authority of the law making stuff happen. But in a sense, this was kind of how they did anything that would require a court or legal action or witnesses. They gathered a quorum. You had to have at least 10 elders present to make so that any ruling could be official. And they're going to ultimately they are there to act as judge and jury. They're there to make sure that whatever dealings happen are fair and that they're seen through. So they're going to act as witnesses that this deal is made so that if someone goes back on it, you've got 10 witnesses who can say, no, you said that you were going to do this thing, so you need to do this thing. That's what was decided in our court. Um, but those are just kind of how everyday business work. Any kind of business dealings that you made, you wanted to have witnesses there because you don't necessarily have all the paperwork that we have today. You don't have somebody writing up receipts. People aren't necessarily all literate to be able to read the receipts either. But if you have 10 people who can all say, oh, yeah, Bob agreed to sell Jimmy his land, Jimmy can't really say, hey, Bob stole my land from me because everyone's like, no, you sold it to him. There was an agreement. We all saw it. We all heard it. And so, yeah, Boaz is doing this on neutral ground. He's not forcing anything on the Redeemer. But he is setting it up so that whatever they decide here is, again, legally binding. They have witnesses who can agree that these decisions were made, and they can hold whoever is the decider. They can hold him accountable and make sure that he upholds it. This was kind of the job of the elders of the city, those who have they're maybe too old to be going out and working in the field or whatever. And now their job is to use all of the wisdom they have accrued in their life to kind of help settle disputes and make sure that everyone is held accountable to what they've said. They can give advice, make sure that they're fair deals and people aren't taking advantage of each other necessarily. Uh, that this was just kind of everyday business at the gate of the city. Because again, pretty much everyone passes through the gate throughout the day. So if you need to confront someone about it, you do it there, and that's where the elders that's their day. They wake up and they just kind of go hang out at the gate of the city, so that when people have to make a decision, they can be like, "I need 10 elders," and then the first 10 who stand up are like, "We're here," and then they can settle that dispute, and then they can go on to their next thing. And when no one's making deals, they can all just sit around and be grumpy old men and talk about all the decisions that are made. Yeah, yeah, they're like they're kind of like the Russian babushka grandmothers who just like stare out their windows and watch everything that's happening so they can gossip about it. But they get to participate too, because when people need to make decisions, they call them to be witnesses and adjudicate over everything. And then when there's not a case going on, they just kind of sit around. They talk to each other about what's going on. And I arbitrated a case between Bob and Jim. Well, I arbitrated a case between Sally and Sue. That's just kind of what the elders do. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Anything else to add? Stuff I'm missing, skipping over? All right, question 8 then. Again, if we're going to compare this to a courtroom setting, who is being placed on trial and what part is Boaz playing? Yeah. 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 So maybe not the best analogy to make this today's courtroom, because again, this was doesn't have the same force of law that you have in today's courtroom setting. But if we're going to push the analogy, um, the kinsman is being put on trial, um, and Boaz is being kind of the prosecutor against him, because that's what he does. He's um, he's forcing the question: if you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know. Um, he's kind of forcing the confrontation. Are you going to redeem it or not? This is technically your job. Are you going to take it, or are you going to pass it on to me? He's, in a sense, he's prosecuting the kinsman um, for not having redeemed it yet, and he's forcing his hand to see what's going to happen. I'm answering question 9 already. So, any other thoughts on 8, or shall I just move on to 9? Or,
It's funny that's mentioned in this book because normally this happened even in the 70s, as close as the 70s.
Mhm.
Their tradition was if somebody dies, so the land doesn't go to and out of the wealth of the family,
Mhm.
they ask if somebody after it's usually 40 days,
Mhm.
they wait 40 days to ensure, well, mostly to ensure there is no pregnancy in the situation. If there's pregnancy in the situation, then they have to wait till the child is born. Then
Mm. Okay.
but the thing is, if there is no child in the way, there is nothing. They ask if somebody is willing to take the widow as a wife,
Mm.
especially if she was young.
Yeah.
And that's where this is happening. Nobody's on trial. The first one, let's say the Redeemer that he was talking about was already married and he cannot take another wife.
Mhm.
Then somebody else has to take another wife. Then
Mhm.
they go next to next to next to next. And if there's nobody, they ask, is anybody young and take a wife willing to take it?
Okay.
If they say yes, they go.
Mhm.
But it's another thing to keep the family will in the tribe. So
Yeah.
it doesn't spread.
Yeah. All right. So apparently, this sort of thing was still happening in the Middle East up to the 70s, where again, it's you're trying to keep the land within the family. So if a man dies, you wait 40 days to see if there's a pregnancy in the situation, and once it's shown that the widow is not pregnant, then they bring it up to the family who's going to marry her and keep it within the family name. And that's the whole concept of the Redeemer that we're having here in Ruth, because the whole point of the Redeemer, like we've said, is that the land of Israel is given to the Israelites by God, but he has given it to them so specifically that the land is supposed to be staying within the family, such that the family, they actually can't sell their land. When it talks about selling their land, they're really selling the harvesting rights to the land, but the land itself remains in the family name. And every 50 years, you have a jubilee, and all land reverts back to its original owner. So you can't. It's very hard to buy land that will now go to your family instead of the person you bought it from in Israel. You can buy the harvesting rights for up to 50 years, depending on where you are getting to the Jubilee. Um, but once the Jubilee comes, the land reverts. And so if you're buying land, you have to be like, you're making an investment that you're going to make enough profit over however much time you have left that um, it's worth it. And you cover your costs and everything. Um, Right. Yeah. You lease the land, but then it comes back to you, and that's the role of the redeemer. Is you know when people do sell their land, it's you don't do that lightly. It's when you're in dire straits and you really need the money that you do this because as we see with Ruth and Naomi, when you don't have the rights to your land, you don't have a source of income. And so the whole point of the redeemer is that when somebody does have to sell their land for one reason or another, their next closest relative has this job and duty and obligation, if he's financially able, to pay off that lease to whoever they bought the land from, so that the land can go back to the original owners and they don't have to wait until the Jubilee to get the land back. So really the only way you can, I'm answering ahead, I'm like getting into like question 11, 12 or something. But really the only way you can buy land permanently would be if you bought the harvesting rights to the land from someone or whatever, and then they died without any heirs and no redeemers step up to claim it, and then the land kind of defaults to you. Um, but yeah, it's hard to buy land that will go to you in perpetuity. Um, we'll get back to that too. Um, hmm, 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 yeah, yeah, and I'm not a I'm not a legal scholar in ancient Middle Eastern real estate law, but yeah, my understanding is if there are no blood relatives left and there's no one to redeem it, then the land I think would just kind of default to whoever had purchased it then. But it's you generally you know unless this is like an 80-year-old man who doesn't have any heirs and you buy the land from him intending that he'll die without anyone to take it, and then you're buying it for yourself. You're not really going into business dealings with the thought that, oh, I'm going to buy this land that's going to be in my family forever now because I bought it. You're going into the dealings being like, all right, I'm going to buy this land so I can farm it and harvest it and make a lot of profit in the 25 years I have until the next Jubilee, and then that land's going to go back, but I'll have made enough profit off of it that will have been worth it for me in the long run, and I will have a bigger, at least financial inheritance that I can pass on to my offspring, not necessarily a greater land inheritance because that's going to revert back at the Jubilee. Does that make sense? Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Since the day my dad died, nobody's gonna claim it, and it's empty, and nobody touches it because it's in my name.
Yeah.
50 years, it goes to the king.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
It's usually the government.
Okay, that's had me in the first half. Not gonna lie. But yeah, in the Old Testament, every 50 years is the Jubilee because it's uh, 7 sets of 7 years because 7 is a number of completion. We like to use it. So 7 times 7 is 49, and then that 50th year is the year-long jubilee. It's a big kind of celebration party year where it's like the whole year is Thanksgiving, and land rights revert back to people. Anyone who is a slave is set free. But each 7 years is kind of its own mini jubilee too. So if you're going way off topic, but I don't care. Slavery in the Old Testament was very different than what we had in the American South in the 1800s, which every time you get an atheist who's like, oh, the Bible condones slavery, and so it's all evil. It's like, because thanks to our cultural heritage, we think all slavery is like what we had in the American South. That's not what slavery is like in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, slavery was closer to indentured servitude. It was a working contract that you sold yourself into, usually to pay your debts, or because you were a prisoner of war and they didn't have standing prisons. And so, if you had a prisoner of war, your options are either you kill them or you make them a slave. And it's like making them a slave is a little bit more merciful because at least they're still alive. But for those who sell themselves into slavery, they're really selling themselves into a 7-year contract because just like the land rights with the Jubilee, every 7 years, all slave contracts get nullified, and so they're set free. So you can only buy a slave for up to 7 years, and then you have to set them free unless they decide that they want to become your slave in perpetuity, which some people did. But really, when it talks about slaves in the Old Testament, it's talking about an indentured servitude on a 7-year contract, because everything's in this 7 cycle that we get from creation. God rests on the 7th day. The 7th day is a Sabbath. Every 7 years, the slaves get free. Every 7 sets of 7 years, you have a Jubilee, and that's when the land rights revert to everybody. Army contracts are 8 years? All right, well, they were close. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, he's selling himself into slavery. It's not, because if you read through all the Old Testament, the idea of what we had in America in the 1800s, where we go to another country and we kidnap a bunch of people and we bring them back to be slaves, that is condemned. You're not allowed to just kidnap people to be your slave in the Old Testament. That's punishable by death. The whole inheriting slavery, where if you're born of a slave, you're just automatically a slave. That's not how it works in the Old Testament either. You have to sell yourself into slavery. Essentially, you're signing a work contract in front of 10 elders who agree that the decision was made. I'm not saying slavery is the best system necessarily, but this knee-jerk reaction everyone has to say, oh, slavery in the Old Testament is exactly like what happened in the American South. That's just kind of a false equivalency to create an emotional appeal instead of looking at what the text is actually saying. Sorry, it comes up a lot in the random dealings I have with internet atheists, so now you know. Let's try to get back on track. Question 9. Boaz presented a well thought out question when he presented to that he then presented to the other kinsman redeemer. List the points with which Boaz confronted the other kinsman redeemer. Right. Yeah, and this is, I think, where the writer of the study gets that prosecutor image for Boaz. Is he's saying, all right, so Naomi is here. She has this land that needs to be redeemed because they had to sell it when they left for Moab. The land needs to be redeemed. You're next in line to be the redeemer. I'm coming after you. Someone has to redeem the land. That's the law of Israel. So are you going to do it or am I going to do it? Act or get off the pot. Stop stalling. And there is, making sure I'm not answering too far ahead. Yeah, and there is sort of an accusatorial tone to all of this. because acting as a redeemer wasn't just a right that you get to do, it was an obligation to family that you're supposed to do. And so, again, if we read between the lines, it's not just, hey, we got to take care of this, so who's going to buy the land? Implicit in it is the accusation of, why haven't you redeemed the land yet? Especially now that you know Naomi is back, you have an obligation to family to act on her behalf and redeem Elimelech's land for her, so that she's not just this poor widow without any income and entirely reliant upon Ruth gleaning for her. So he's, again, like I said, Boaz is being a little bit passive aggressive about the whole thing. He's sort of guilt tripping him a little bit. Why haven't you done this yet? Does that make sense? Am I expressing this rightly? Okay.
Sorry. The thing is, I don't think it's that way 100%. He's asking him. He doesn't just doesn't want to step on his toes. He's like, yes, this wants to hold up,
Mm-hmm.
but he's like, look, if you don't want to do it, just say I want to do it. Especially that it's not with Naomi, with Ruth.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a marriage situation too. It's not as simple as buying just buy her land back and give it to her.
Yeah, the Ruth question does complicate things a little bit, which we'll get to in the next couple of questions. Um, yeah, I will say, based on the commentaries that I was studying for this, because there is this obligation to act as a redeemer, the analysis I read says that we should read this as a little bit of a guilt tripping. Why haven't you been acting upon your obligations to family to redeem this already? So, um, yeah. Again, we're making we don't know for sure that he knew Naomi is back, but that's kind of the assumption, because, again, small town people gossip. It was kind of a big event when Naomi comes back in the first place. Again, when Boaz first sees Ruth out gleaning in the field, and he asks his assistants, like, who's that lady over there? They're able to, like, oh, that's Ruth who came back with Naomi, and Boaz is like, oh, I've heard about her. There's kind of this reputation around her already. So it's the assumption is that he would have known Naomi was back, and that he did have this obligation to redeem the land. And so, like, yeah, yeah, yeah. So, again, it's, as long as he's financially able to. I mean, if he just couldn't afford to redeem the land, then you can't put yourself into debt to redeem someone else, and then you need redemption because you put yourself into debt for it. But as long as you're financially able to redeem the land, that's your obligation to your family, is to redeem it and keep the land in the family as much as possible. Um, and so there is a little bit of guilt tripping on him for dragging his feet about the whole thing. Um, yeah, yeah. And this is there. So there's two theories that I read as I was researching this. There's two theories on why the kinsman redeemer's name is not given. Like everyone else's name, you have Naomi and Ruth and Boaz and everything, but then he's just the redeemer. And behold, the redeemer of who Boaz had spoken by. So he's just referred to by his title as redeemer, and he's not named. And the two theories I've seen as to why he's not given a name in this whole narrative is either A, because he's guilty of dragging his feet, and this is a way to shame him, that his name kind of gets erased from history, that we don't even get a name out of this text because he acted so shamefully in not redeeming Naomi's land like he was supposed to. Or it's an act of mercy for the sake of his reputation, because this was a very shameful thing for him to have dragged his feet and not redeemed the land. But when they write down the narrative of Ruth, they're like, let's protect his reputation and, like, not get people mad at his kids. So we just won't say exactly what his name is, and people can't get mad at him. But either theory, there is this implication that there's a large amount of shame in him dragging his feet. Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you have access to the family records, you can find out well enough. But there is this implication of shame around him for not acting to redeem the land in the first place, and so that's why the commentators are getting this kind of implied guilt trip from Boaz on why haven't you done this thing that you're supposed to do yet? Um, yeah, because then he says, yeah, like Boaz lays it all before him. He's like, okay, then I will redeem it. I'm like, you got me. Now that I've been confronted in front of elders, I can't put it off any longer. I'll redeem it. So, which, yeah, that's question 10. How did the nameless kinsman redeemer respond? Is there any hesitation on his part? He agrees to redeem it. Doesn't, I mean, he may have hesitated. We don't know the tone of voice when he says it. All we have in the text, like after Boaz confronts him, it just says, and he said, I will redeem it. There doesn't seem to be any hesitation now that he's being called out upon it. Yeah. Yeah. Again, this is the way he says it matters, and we don't have that recorded in text. That's why there's always the debate on how much inflection you're supposed to do when you're reading the text in church, because inflection is a matter of communication too. So they're apparently back in like the 50s, they used to teach that you're supposed to read the text completely neutrally and not have any inflection or going up or down or emotionality, so people just hear the text and they don't hear any extra interpretation upon it. And then that gets very boring and monotone. That's why in in the medieval ages, they just chanted the texts, and they had chanting tones that you just applied to everything. So that's not monotonous, but you already have a prescribed way of reading it so that you're not adding your own interpretation to it. So people are still just getting the text with some variety, but they're not getting the added interpretation of the inflection on it. But with some of our readers, I don't think people would take too kindly to chanting all of the readings. I'd be willing to do it, but that's a lot of work for me too. So not eager to do it either necessarily. But again, they warn us in seminary, like don't do the monotone thing. You're allowed to read it somewhat naturally, but don't go overboard or like really add extra stuff that creates an interpretation of the text. Because again, we don't have that records either. So if our reading for the day is Ruth chapter 4, and I get up in the lectern and it says, and I get to verse 4, and I said, and he said, I will redeem it. That's very different than if he says, and he said, I will redeem it. The words are the same, but the meaning behind them changes with the inflection. And so whenever you're reading the word to people, you have to be kind of try to find that middle ground between not sounding like a robot and not adding to the text that you don't necessarily know you can add to the text either. That was a weird tangent. Prosody. Okay, that's your word for the day. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 You're getting us into 11. So although, yeah, we're at time now. So I don't know. Do we want to? Kind of feel like 11's a good starter for next week. So yeah, I think we'll call it now. Hold that thought. So next week we'll start at 11. I actually thought we'd get through this whole lesson today. Sorry. So we'll start 11 next week, and at the rate we've been going, we'll spend next week just finishing up lesson 5. But just in case we don't, lesson 6 packets are on the chair back there. And again, because the numbering system is weird, the write-up on lesson 6 applies to the questions of lesson 5, so you can read that on your own if you like. But then the lesson 6 questions are for verses 7 through 12. So after we finish the lesson 5 questions, we'll move on to the lesson 6 questions. We'll see if that happens next week or if we spend the whole time on 5 and then we get to 6 next time. But they're available in the back if you would like to grab them on your way out or whatever. But we're at time, so I will pray us out and then get ready for the service. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, again, we thank you for the examples that we see in Ruth and how we can see that Boaz was the faithful Redeemer and giving us this other way to better understand the way that Christ was our Redeemer. We thank you for this opportunity to gather together to study your word and gain this deeper appreciation for what Boaz does and to help us to understand better what you have done for us. So we ask that you would continue to keep us in your hands and bless us as we are about to enter the worship service and receive that redemption that you have won for us through your Son, Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.